Are Middle East wars a cover for fulfilling quotas to extraterrestrials for human soldiers? Aloha everyone, I'm Dr. Michael Salla and this is Exopolitics Today. I'm responding to an article that appeared on March 9 in Zero Hedge that discussed 9 signs that there's going to be a new war in the Middle East. And it examined what the Biden administration has been doing that's showing that we might be seeing an upgrade in military hostilities in Syria, and that would be followed soon after by Iran. So this is really a sign that the deep state through this Biden administration is going to fulfill an agenda that was first revealed as far back as 2001. In 2001, General Wesley Clark, the 4-star general who was former Supreme Allied Commander for the European forces, went to the Pentagon and was told by fellow generals about a plan for the invasion of 7 countries after the 9/11 attacks. So this is 7 additional countries to Afghanistan. And the list included Iraq, Lebanon, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Syria, and then finally Iran. And what really made that list of countries very significant was that indeed conflicts did break out in those countries, except for Iran. Now, in the case of Syria, things really escalated into a full-blown civil war. And this was only really put to a stop or mitigated when Russia intervened in 2015 during the Obama administration. And during the Obama administration, really President Obama contributed a lot to the Syrian civil war by first really delaying any kind of support to democratic forces in Syria that wanted to bring about regime change, and only after they had been crushed by Islamic zealots that the CIA began to intervene and help the Islamic zealots or the Islamic radicals take on the regime of Syria's Bashar Assad, which really is a secular regime. With the election of Donald Trump, he really put a stop to the US intervening in Syria and really wanted to just let the Russians control it. And while there was a lot of pushback in the military by those that really were committed to the neocon agenda, he really didn't want to get involved. And now, of course, we have this Biden administration in power for the moment, and we're seeing signs that there's going to be intervention in Syria. Now, why is that? Why would the US want to get involved in Syria and then follow that up with possibly contriving a war between Iran and Israel that would then suck in the United States, suck in China, leading to a really devastating regional war? Why would the US be doing that? Well, I think one of the things we need to keep in mind is that behind the scenes there is this exopolitical dimension that is happening. That is a struggle for getting control over extraterrestrial technologies all over the world. There was the first Iraq Gulf War that was initiated by President Bush back in 1991. And then that was followed by his son, George W. Bush, authorizing the second Iraq War in 2003. Now, I actually covered that second Gulf War in a number of articles and in my first Exopolitics book that came out in 2004, and found a number of people that talked about one of the major goals for that Iraq War was to actually get control of stargates, that this was advanced extraterrestrial technology that had been developed in ancient Sumeria, or had been used in ancient Sumeria by a group of extraterrestrials known as the Anunnaki, and that there were a lot of cuneiform texts describing the operation of these stargates and what the extraterrestrials did in Sumer and around the world over 6,000 years ago, which is when ancient Sumer was developed. And so that Iraq war and many other wars around the world are really predicated on this secret race to find and control ancient technologies, extraterrestrial technologies in particular, and to find extraterrestrial artifacts in the form of stasis chambers housing some of these ancient giants. That's something else that's part of this race. So to my mind, this was a big factor in why it is so many wars are contrived, especially the ones in the Middle East, which involve ancient lands where you have these advanced technologies, extraterrestrial technologies, buried in deep underground facilities. So whether we're talking about Afghanistan, whether we're talking about Iran, Syria, these are, and of course Lebanon and Palestine, all of these places are very old. Ancient civilizations operated there, and so it makes sense that there's a lot of really advanced technologies that are buried. And this is why the neocons have been driving the US to get involved in these different areas for 2 decades now. So that was one reason for the Middle East wars. Another reason for these Middle East wars is that it allows the CIA to generate this enormous unofficial black budget that goes to funding secret space programs, unacknowledged special access programs, and many other highly classified programs where a lot of these advanced extraterrestrial technologies have been developed. And so you have the drug trade and a lot of things occurring in conflict zones which actually help the CIA generate enormous amounts of money for their programs. So that was another factor. But recently I've learned of yet a third major factor that involves extraterrestrials or extraterrestrial related projects, and that is these agreements that date back to the Mohammedan era. We're talking of around 600, 700 AD, where apparently there were a set of agreements reached. Some describe them as the Muhammad Accords, others have described them as the Greada Accords. And one of the accords dealt with the conditions that would then exist between humanity and extraterrestrials visiting or residing on Earth. That from that era on, from around 600 AD and on, extraterrestrials would not openly intervene or openly appear in human affairs. They wouldn't show up in cities, they wouldn't be worshipped as gods. And this kind of like really dovetailed with the rise of monotheistic religions throughout the world. And so the old pagan gods, Odin, Zeus, Jupiter, Indra, all over the world there were these pagan gods that kind of like fell into disfavor in places where monotheism took off. And one of the aspects of these agreements was that the extraterrestrials would now operate behind the scenes and negotiate directly with human leaders rather than appearing and influencing human affairs that way. And one of the aspects of these agreements dealt with the extraterrestrials, especially reptilian extraterrestrials, being allowed to go into different areas where conflicts would be started and the extraterrestrials could go in there and fight against the soldiers, the human soldiers there, or take people that are caught up in that violence. And so I think that this is something I covered in an interview I did with a Brazilian author and researcher, Fabio Santos, who co-wrote a book called Planetary Intervention, where he described these ancient agreements where these human soldiers would be sent to conflict zones where they would meet with extraterrestrials and their job was to fight them. So the conflict zones were set up in a way that it would be a cover for the extraterrestrials to openly come out, fight with human soldiers, and no one would be any wiser to it because it was a conflict zone. So in that book, Planetary Intervention, it describes Bosnia as one of these conflict zones around the 1993 and 1995 era. So I think this helps explain why it was that the neocons were wanting to get so desperately into these Middle Eastern countries, not only to find advanced extraterrestrial technologies, not only to be able to use the conflicts as a cover for generating the drug trade so that they could have enormous amounts of money being raised by the CIA through the drug trade, but also to fulfill these extraterrestrial agreements where you would have a number of human soldiers in a conflict zone, and extraterrestrials could openly appear in those conflict zones and fight against the soldiers. And of course, no one would believe any soldiers saying that all of a sudden this, 9-foot tall reptilian being suddenly appeared, and my platoon fought against him, and we suffered tremendous losses. Well, in a conflict zone, no one's going to pay attention to that stuff because it really is life and survival. So I think this kind of helps us get a better handle on why these conflict zones are something that the deep state wants to create, and why it is that the Biden administration in particular is so eager apparently to generate new wars in the Middle East, because I think that the Biden administration really is working with the deep state, and they are, I think, simply fulfilling one of the conditions for these ancient agreements, where you need to have so many conflicts, so many people, so many soldiers in conflict zones, and that's where the reptilian extraterrestrials can appear and fight, just as we saw depicted in this soft disclosure movie, the Predator series, which really was soft disclosure. So that's my take on what is happening right now with the Biden administration, the looming US interventions in Syria, and the fostering of a new major war in Iran, which would be really devastating and a great setback for all of us if the Biden administration was to facilitate that. But I think that's what we're witnessing. So hopefully a lot of liberal progressives that voted for Joe Biden are maybe experiencing buyer's remorse. We'll see. So thank you for listening. If you want to learn more, just go to my website, exopolitics.org. Also, I want to announce that on March 27, I'll be holding another webinar. It's going to be titled The Great Awakening versus the Global Reset, How Full Disclosure Trumps Transhumanism and Artificial Intelligence. So in that webinar, I will be discussing transhumanism and how there has been this effort to create super soldiers. And one of the reasons for that is this idea that these super soldiers will actually fight extraterrestrials in these battle zones, and that is part of the fulfillment of these secret agreements. Really incredible stuff, but you can learn more just by going to my website and visiting exopolitics.org. Thank you for listening and subscribing.